Hello, APUSHers. Today we're looking at key terms for Period 2. These terms come straight out of the College Board framework for AP US History and are many times in questions and possible responses on AP US History exams. I highly recommend taking notes during the video as that will help with retention. Okay, let's jump into it. First, let's pick up where we left off in Period 1, and that is Spanish colonization. During Period 2, Spain continued to expand their power and control over their colonies in the New World, along with their caste-based racial hierarchical system that dominated the social, political, and economic structure of their colonies. In Period 2, they were now in more direct competition with France and Great Britain in the transatlantic trade. Also, several conflicts broke out between Spain and rising European powers. And by the end of the period, Spain had started a long, slow decline in power and prestige. We're going to take a quick look at French colonization of North America. As you can see on the right in blue and purple, the French claimed large swaths of territory from New Orleans up to eastern Canada. In the more northern reaches of modern-day Canada, the French focused on the fur trade in the Hudson Bay and St. Lawrence areas. It was only lightly populated by the French, who struck treaties and fur trade agreements with native tribes. There was a considerable amount of intermarriage between French traders and settlers, and Native Americans. And the French did have numerous Catholic priests and orders focused on converting the Native Americans, unlike the nearby British colonies. The British began colonization a little later than other European powers. They focused more on trade than conversion of natives to Christianity. Their colonies were also safe havens for various groups, including Puritans and Quakers. The British were also more homogeneous than the Spanish, with very little intermarriage with natives or Africans. The map on the right shows their colonies on the mainland. However, most of their activity in Period 2 was in the Caribbean. In the Spanish colonies, and to a lesser extent the French colonies, there was a great amount of mixing between Spanish, Native Americans, and Africans. For the Spanish colonies, this resulted in a complex racial caste system seen on the right. There were different rules and laws for each caste. Those on top had the most privilege, while those on the bottom had the least. This is contrasted with the British, which stayed much more homogeneous. Indentured servants were a labor force for colonies in the New World. It is different from slavery. Servants were poor or possibly imprisoned Europeans, who in return for their passage to the New World, contracted their labor out for a period of time, typically in the 5 to 7 year range. The servant had very few rights while indentured, but once the contract was completed, they were free. This system was ripe with corruption, as some masters treated their servants horribly, and extended a servant's contract if they disobeyed or tried to escape. The transatlantic slave trade occurred roughly from the early 16th century to the mid-19th century. It is hard to know for sure the exact numbers, but historians estimated that the trade transported around 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the New World. Once in the New World, enslaved Africans were forced to perform many types of jobs. Most of them toiled away on cash crop plantations, especially sugar and tobacco early on, and later cotton. Harsh chattel laws were passed in many colonies, making slavery race-based, and those laws typically cut off any path to legal freedom for an enslaved person. Africans also resisted enslavement in two ways, the first being overt resistance, which included running away in rebellions like the Stono or Nat Turner. Later on in periods 4 and 5, we will discuss the whole network of helping escape slaves called the Underground Railroad. Overt was not the only way Africans resisted enslavement, as there were constant acts of covert resistance, which include some examples like working slowly, faking an illness, and stealing food. Moving on to a different topic, Puritans were British Protestants who followed Calvin's teachings and believed in predestination. They felt the Anglican Church did not reform itself enough after the split with Catholicism. At times they were persecuted in England. Some pilgrims set off to completely separate themselves from England. These were the settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the Mayflower and set up the Plymouth colony. Others worked within the colonial framework to establish a colony based in Puritan beliefs. This was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which eventually will engulf the Plymouth colony. When the British settled in North America, they had a much more homogeneous society than the Spanish or French colonies. A homogeneous society means a society that shares the same traits like language and culture. This is in contrast to the Spanish, who had a lot more intermixing in their colonies between Spanish, Africans, and Native Americans. Now on to the Middle Colonies, which were very diverse compared to the more Puritan New England and cash crop-focused Virginia areas. There's a lot I could say about all of these colonies, but let's keep it brief to just the notable information for APUSH. Pennsylvania will be secured as a safe haven for pacifist and nonconformist Quakers, and that colony will focus on wheat production. And New York actually started out as a Dutch colony, with New York City being first called New Amsterdam. After some shenanigans in Europe, the Dutch basically gave New York to the British. The now New York City is known for its good harbor and position on the East Coast that allowed it to grow to a major center of trade. The Middle Colonies became the early breadbasket of the British colonies. They produced surpluses of wheat and corn, which are referred to as staple crops. These crops help feed other areas of the colonies that produce less food and more cash crops like Virginia. They were also exported to England. For the Pueblo Revolt, we go back to the Spanish colonies, and specifically Spanish New Mexico, where Native Americans were treated very poorly by the Spanish, including suppressing their traditional beliefs and putting huge demands on native labor. The Pueblo Native Americans rebelled against Spanish officials, priests, and settlers, and for a short period of time had driven them out of the region. However, the Spanish would return, but became more tolerant and accommodating to Native American beliefs and culture. I went into a lot more detail in a separate video specifically about the topic, so check that out. Okay, next important term. The British had a strong viewpoint on property rights and contracts when it applied to dealings between each other. However, in colonizing North America, British settlers pushed against Native American territory, resulting in conflict with Native Americans, and usually Native Americans being pushed off their land. This was in part due to feelings of superiority over Native Americans. In general, Great Britain and Europe had a very patriarchal society. Women, if married, had no claim to property or even children if the marriage was annulled. They believed women had their sphere, which was housework, raising children, subservient to their husband, and being pious and moral center of the family, while the men's sphere was outdoor work, drinking in the tavern with mates, and the leader of the family in business or political matters. So when referring to the Atlantic world, we are talking about the political, cultural, and economic exchanges around the Atlantic Ocean because of the interactions between Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. This also heavily impacted the development of the colonies in North America and led to economic growth in several European countries, including Spain and England. It also changed labor systems as well as expanded social networks. Finally, the labor market exchange of European and New World goods impacted the Atlantic economy, as shown in the transatlantic slave trade and shipment of products and resources from the Americas to Europe. Okay, on to the Enlightenment, which is a European intellectual movement throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It focused on rational thought, science, and logic. Some of its most influential philosophers were John Locke, Adam Smith, and Descartes. Their ideas of self-government and natural rights, especially Locke's, will have a great influence on colonial American leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. We will revisit those ideas with the Declaration of Independence and Common Sense in Period 3. Roughly the time period of the First Great Awakening goes from the 1730s to the 1770s. We will mostly focus on the impacts in colonial America, but note that this is also an international movement, as it is also occurring in Europe, which shows an example of transatlantic exchange of ideas. Core to the Great Awakening is the revitalization of religious piety. Some may say it is a counter to the more secular Enlightenment movement popular among educated elites. And at the very least, it runs concurrent to it. Another major facet to the First Great Awakening is the distinction between the old light preachers, who are more likely to be longtime hometown ministers and offer a more conservative or moderate style and content to their sermons, versus the new light preachers, who are a major part of the First Great Awakening. They were more likely to be traveling preachers that attracted huge crowds to their sermons, which were filled with raucous hellfire and brimstone style oration. And many times the crowds would participate with shouts along the lines of, "Save me." Two of the major New Light preachers you will see on the AP test are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, both of whom spoke of terrifying images of the corruption of human nature and terrors awaiting unbelievers and sinners who did not repent. Also, the First Great Awakening is an excellent example of Protestant evangelism, or the practice of spreading Christianity. In Period 1, we talked a lot about the Roman Catholic Church and its major goals of spreading Christianity. For Protestants, the First Great Awakening is an example for them. And finally, the First Great Awakening and the traveling New Light preachers were particularly popular in the rural backcountry across colonial America. Finally is the economic policy of mercantilism, which was employed by the colonizing European powers that sought to maximize exports and limit imports through a highly regulated trading network. These policies aimed to increase their wealth, usually meaning gold and silver of a nation, so it would increase its power and prestige. Looking specifically at the British, they tried to create a closed system of trade between their colonies and mother country. The Navigation Acts are a great example of this. At the same time, they tried to increase their exports like textiles from their mother country to their colonies and other European powers. Everything going in and out was taxed. Important note, the American colonies were always trying to sidestep this system with ignoring the export rules and taxes. When the British clamped down in Period 3, this will be a major cause of the revolution. Okay, that does it for the explanations of the key terms in Period 2. Please subscribe and share the channel with your fellow classmates and teachers. With many districts going to hybrid or distance learning this year, it could be a great aid to both.